Class is now in session at Strixhaven, and pre-release is almost upon us. Whether you're playing at home with some pre-release kits, checking out the sealed queue on Magic Arena, or you're just lucky enough to have a local game store able to run events safely, you're bound to be itching to dive in. In this video, we'll be covering Strixhaven Sealed. We'll briefly go over the ins and outs of a pre-release event, cover the main archetypes, and anything else you need to know in a concise format. As ever, though you can play on Magic Arena and Magic Online, consider supporting your local game store by ordering some pre-release kits for delivery or curbside pickup. If your store is open, give it your support and keep it open. At-home pre-release is still overwhelmingly the way you'll experience Strixhaven. Check with your local game store on how you can take advantage of this, whether by having pre-release kits delivered to your door or by using curbside pickup to get your product. Local game stores are doing their best to give excellent customer service in these times, and I can't emphasize enough how important it is to keep up your support where possible. I'll be discussing the main archetypes and mechanics of this set in just a moment, but first, there's a key difference between Strixhaven Prerelease and the last few sets, and that's the pre-release kits. Lorehold, Silverquill, Prismari, Quandrix, and Witherbloom each have a unique pre-release kit. Inside each kit, you'll find 5 Strixhaven School of Mages Draft Boosters, 1 Strixhaven School of Mages College Booster, 1 foil promo-stamped rare or mythic card from Strixhaven School of Mages, a digital redemption code for Magic Arena, and 1 Spin Down Life counter. That's right, the 6th pack is replaced with a college-themed booster, which contains a selection of cards from that college's limited archetype, including an on-color rare or mythic. If you were around for Guilds of Ravnica and Ravnica Allegiance, you might recognize this approach to playing Sealed for pre-release weekend. It's a little shakeup that Wizards likes to do from time to time, and works to ensure you get to have fun with the archetype you're interested in by giving you additional guaranteed cards. Pick whichever college interests you. As for which college I'd pick, it doesn't matter. I didn't get accepted into any of them. The grades on my transcripts just weren't up to snuff. But I'm sure you'll all get in, and now that you have, what's the plan? Opening your pool. The first thing to do is open things up and see what you have. There are many ways to open and sort your pool, and I've covered in depth how to do this in a previous video, so we'll cover things more briefly here. If you'd like the more in-depth walkthrough, you should check out that other video linked in the description. As always, when you open your packs, sort them first by color: white, blue, black, red, green, multicolor, colorless, and lands. Then you can further split them into the cards you'd like to play, and the cards you'd be happy to play. The former category is for all those bombs and removal spells, with the latter being made up of filler vanilla creatures and the like. When it comes to Strixhaven, keep in mind that your sideboard pile may have more playables than usual because it can contain the new lesson cards. I'll go over what these are in just a moment, and how they affect pools based on the fact that, well, so often they are playable. It's also a good idea to split out your multicolor cards so that you can see if you have enough to build a particular college deck. Even if you choose the Prismari pre-release kit, you might end up with better multicolor Quandrix cards, depending on how the packs go. Keep in mind that, if this is the case, you might end up playing blue-green instead, with the chance to splash some of your Prismari cards. Pre-release kits only boost the odds of being able to build a deck in that college's colors. They don't guarantee it. Building a limited deck is mostly a solved prospect, with some variations based on the individual limited environment. The general rule is to shoot for 17 lands and 23 spells, and play the colors that let you play your best cards. After you've opened your packs and constructed the 40-card minimum deck, you'll be ready to play. Rounds are played best of 3, with a chance to sideboard in between games should you wish. As it's a limited event, the rest of your pool will be your sideboard, so you'll not be restricted to only 15 cards like in constructed formats. Instead, with lessons, you'll be able to make use of your sideboard more than usual. On Arena, you'll be able to play with your sealed deck until you get 7 wins or 3 losses, whichever comes first. Now let's go over the mechanics and archetypes of Strixhaven. Before we cover the archetypes you'll use to build your deck, let's first check out the mechanics for Strixhaven. The main mechanics of the set are Ward, Magecraft, and Learn/Lesson. Strixhaven also features modal double-faced cards. If you've played Magic over the past year, you'll be familiar with how these work. Just concentrate on curving out and playing the side that's best for you at the right moment. There's no holding a card for the perfect moment if you can have a reasonably good card in play right now, so don't get too hung up on it. Remember, this isn't Commander, so you can play a modal card with the expectation you'll only cast one side of it, even if you're not splashing the other color. Selfless Glyph Weaver is great in a Lorehold deck, for example. It's a completely acceptable approach. Ward is similar to Hexproof and is in many ways a fairer version. Wizards likes it so much it's apparently now going to be evergreen and appear in many future sets. Ward is a triggered ability, and whenever a creature with Ward becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, it is countered unless that player pays the Ward cost. For this card, the Ward cost is 2 generic mana, but it can be more, or it can even be paying with life. Now, while takesy-backsies are usually given freely when playing casually at your local game store during pre-release, keep in mind that on Magic Arena, you'll still be able to resolve the spell targeting a creature with Ward, as Ward doesn't stop the spell from happening. So if you play a spell and tap out, you won't have a chance to take it back. And you won't be able to pay the mana, so your spell's going to be countered. Watch out. Ward doesn't show up too much in the set, but it'll be most relevant on flying bodies like Waterfall Aerialist and Owlin Shield Mage, as flyers are usually the better creatures in Limited. You should be playing these cards. Next, we'll have Magecraft. Whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, you get a beneficial effect. This can be something as innocuous as a +1/+0 buff until end of turn, or as powerful as drawing a card. When evaluating which of these to put in your deck, keep in mind that you still need to evaluate them with the basic principles you would any other card. Where is their floor, and what is the most common scenario? A card like Leonin Lightscribe will always, at base, be a 2/2 for 2. A Planeswalker like Professor Onyx is still a Planeswalker at the end of the day, and the Magecraft ability is just gravy. Perhaps the most impactful mechanic when it comes to how this set will feel to play, Lesson and Learn are really 2 mechanics that happen to work together. When you cast a card with Learn, you may do one of 3 things. Reveal a Lesson card from your sideboard to put into your hand, discard a card, then draw a card, or nothing. Whether you play these cards will come down to how good your lesson cards are, and if the baseline of these cards is good. First Day of Class has a really strong effect, and even if you have nothing to grab from the sideboard, you might play it as a way to buff and give haste to your creatures, while also digging for a new card. You might only have creature cards in your hand, though, so opting to do nothing when you learn might still be good enough. Lesson cards are, for the most part, deliberately overcosted due to their utility as sideboard cards. While the best of them, like Mascot Exhibition, are definitely main deckable, others are situational, and some, like Confront the Past, are virtually unplayable. When it comes to deck building, I'd consider how useful splashable lessons can be. If you leave them in your sideboard, you don't risk them clogging up your draws and sitting uncastable in your hand if you don't draw the right mana. On the other hand, if you are planning on running a few lessons, make sure you run a good amount of cards that learn. I'd say 4 is the minimum, which you can adjust based on how many of the playable learn cards you open, and how good your lessons are. But of course, this will vary from situation to situation. A spell-heavy experience. One thing to consider about Strixhaven's limited environment is that there are a greater number of instants and sorceries than usual. This has 2 main impacts. Firstly, there are more token-producing instants and sorceries than usual, so whilst decks will have fewer opportunities at creature spells than usual, they should still be able to field enough creatures through way of non-creature spells and other effects. This is a really clever design by Wizards, especially as it makes cards with Magecraft slightly better than they would be in the average limited environment, like a Cube or Chaos Draft. This leads me on to the second point, which is combat tricks and combat will be a minefield. Magecraft will trigger during combat when you and the opponent are casting spells, so be sure to calculate correctly when you decide the odds of your opponent having it. A simple trick versus trick scenario gets more complex when your mages attempt to outdo each other. And that's not to mention that your opponent might have access to something from the Mystical Archive. That's right. If you open one of those special cards in Sealed, you can play with it. Just imagine opening Time Warp or Mind's Desire. It's going to be a lot of fun, and there will be blowouts aplenty. Strixhaven Archetypes. The archetypes of Strixhaven are, unsurprisingly, the college houses. Unlike in Kaldheim, where we had 10 distinct color pairs, and a few other archetypes too, Strixhaven is focused on these 5 colleges. There might well be undiscovered archetypes, like the Gates deck in Guilds of Ravnica, but first years are advised to stick to the syllabus for now. Lorehold. Lorehold likes to play around in the graveyard and cares specifically about cards leaving the graveyard. When cards leave your graveyard, you'll be able to take advantage of some of the payoffs, which include scry triggers and making the 3/2 spirit tokens. Exiling cards to pay costs isn't the only way to make them leave the graveyard, so keep an eye out for valuable recursion pieces that can help you keep attacking by buying cards back. When you put together a Lorehold deck, you might find it leans more toward combat and attacking. Blade Historian is the perfect curve topper for this type of Lorehold deck. On the other hand, Radiant Scroll Wielder hints towards another style of build that focuses on instants and sorceries. The deck that plays more spells and tricks will likely prioritize flyers and evasive creatures and burn spells, and probably plays similar to a blue-white flyers deck, wanting to make tempo plays. Lorehold Apprentice fits into both of those builds, and acts as somewhat of an anchor. The colleges are deep enough to support multiple decks because of how the set is designed to be drafted, so don't be surprised if you have some cards that lean one way and some that lean another. Prismari. Prismari is, in many ways, a comfortable blue-red spell-slinger deck. Its focus in Strixhaven is on making expensive splashy plays more achievable and worth doing. Early game, you'll play evasive creatures like Spectacle Mage and Maelstrom Muse to help you get set up. With the right synergy cards, it is entirely possible to play fast and loose, discarding your bigger spells, secure in the knowledge that you can still cast them. And when it comes to the final act, there are some nice cheap ways to copy the spell for value. Prismari looks content to sit behind respectable bodies and wait for the right moment to make a move. Wormhole Serpent is probably better than it looks, and Snowday might well win games. Quandrix. Quandrix is, not surprisingly, wanting to do very blue-green things. The core of your Quandrix decks wants to ramp and draw cards, and your goal is to outvalue the opponent. Their multicolor cards ask you to make combat difficult for the opponent, not least because your creatures are going to be larger than theirs. Square Up is a neat combat trick that turns anything you have, with counters on it, like a fractal token, into a much larger creature. Your reward for being in Quandrix is that there are plenty of ways to make your best creatures worth the effort. Double Major is honestly just fantastic, but the cards you'll see more often and want to prioritize are the ones that grant trample or unblockable. Silverquill. Silverquill has 2 distinct strengths in Strixhaven Limited. Firstly, it's all about flying and pumping your creatures. Shadewing Laureate is the anchor this strategy likes to depend on, and there are no shortage of effects that give incidental buffs. You'll take advantage of the ways Silverquill can build towards a crescendo in similar ways to Prismari. You'll also want to prioritize ways in which to disrupt the opponent, punishing both value-based decks and long-term plans. Silverquill is also home to a strong control deck, and, backed by Killian, this deck can be hyper-efficient in doling out removal. There are plenty of options, and Silverquill has easily the best access to removal, with Necrotic Fumes being both main deckable and also easy to access by learning. If you do go the more control-heavy route, make sure to pack Inevitability, Spectre of the Fens, Owlin Shield Mage, Dueling Coach, cards that have a way of ending games if they stick around. Finally, we have Witherbloom. Witherbloom cares about gaining and draining life, about creating and using tokens, and, apparently, about big beaters. You'll want to gum up the board with pest tokens to cause pesky problems for your opponents, allowing you to attack freely with your stronger creatures. While other colors care about a storm count, you'll care more about a life count. Forgettable tricks like Fortifying Drought and Essence Infusion will give you a lot of value, and Bayou Groth becomes extremely efficient the more pest tokens you can create. Witherbloom also has access to some great recursion, and you might end up with a deck that cares less about pest tokens and more about sticking hard to deal with creatures. When combined with the great removal available in black, you should be able to build a reliably strong deck, made better with one of the best removal spells in the set, Mortality Spear. Splashing a color. Running a main color pair that isn't one of the colleges is inadvisable, as you won't have access to the strongest multicolor cards on offer, and your spells are unlikely to synergize. That said, while it'll be easiest to stick to one of the 5 enemy color pairs, there's no reason you can't splash. If you're lucky enough to open Letter of Acceptance or Environmental Sciences, they'll give you a huge boost when splashing, though they aren't strictly necessary. 3 to 4 sources of a splash color in a 17-land deck should work out okay for the odd card. Of course, Treasure is what'll really help with splashing, and for once, it isn't base green decks that have the easiest splashing options. Prismari, fittingly, are creative enough to splash easier by using Treasure. While opening Galazeth is a long shot, there are plenty of Prismari spells that can make Treasure and 2 great red cards that can be utilized in a Lorehold deck too. Besides splashing for removal, you'll want to splash for cards that bleed over into your strategy. While Fractal Summoning is easy to take in a Witherbloom deck to help synergize with your copy of Tend the Pests, cards like Multiple Choice and Kasmina require splashing. If you were to open these Quandrix cards, though, it's not a stretch to splash them, as they're useful token producers with a low splash commitment. By adding a few blue sources to your deck, you can then increase the chance to cast Fractal Summoning on curve as well. And that about covers it. All you need to know to enjoy a Strixhaven Prerelease or Sealed event. If you'd like a more in-depth lesson about building a sealed deck, check out my video on the subject here and linked in this video's description. If you're interested in learning more about Draft, I've got you covered there as well. And either way, every way, I hope that this video has been of some use to you, and I wish you the very best of luck when you open your packs. Our script supervisor for this episode was Kristen Gregory, and our editor, Patrick Lickman. And remember, Mystical Archive is set to really spice up the draft environment, so keep on your toes. If you found this video helpful, remember to like, share, and subscribe, or just leave a comment. What college of Strixhaven are you going to pick for pre-release and why? Let me know in the comments below.